If America cannot agree inside the room where the decisions are made, how can it project power outside it? That is the question Iran may have just forced onto Washington. The Director of National Intelligence resigns. A possible Iran deal is suddenly being discussed. Oil prices move on every rumor about Hormuz. And Trump's own party is already arguing over whether a deal would be strength or surrender. Officially, Tulsi Gabbard says she is leaving for family reasons, but her resignation landed at the exact moment when Trump's team faces one of the hardest questions in foreign policy. Is Iran a war, a deal, or a trap? Because if Trump's own national security team cannot agree on what Iran means, the rest of the world sees more than a crisis. It sees a superpower arguing with itself. And when America argues with itself, rivals do not wait. Let me start with what I actually know. Tulsi Gabbard served as the Director of National Intelligence, the person whose job it is to synthesize the entire American intelligence apparatus and present one clear picture of global threats to the President of the United States. That is not a background role. That is, arguably, the most important analytical position in the entire national security system. She resigned, officially citing her husband's cancer diagnosis and family reasons. I am not here to question that. Personal circumstances are real. Family is real. But here is what I can say with confidence. The timing matters. Not because timing proves anything, but because in geopolitics, timing is a signal. And right now, every signal around Iran is pointing in multiple directions at once. Reports describe broader tensions in the background. These are not confirmed causal links. They are the context into which Gabbard's departure fell. And that context is worth understanding. Think about what the Director of National Intelligence actually does. Every major foreign policy decision, strike or don't strike, deal or no deal, sanction or negotiate, depends on the intelligence picture that office produces. How close is Iran to a nuclear threshold? What is Tehran actually willing to accept in a negotiation? What happens to U.S. forces and allies if Hormuz becomes a flashpoint? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions the president needs answered before he does anything. And if the person whose job it is to produce that unified picture is no longer in the room, the question becomes larger than personnel. It becomes a question of strategic unity. Washington has seen high-level departures before. Every administration loses key figures. The story of any presidency is partly the story of who stays and who goes, and what that reveals about the pressures building underneath. What makes this moment different is what is happening on the outside at the same time. Because while Washington processed the news of Gabbard's departure, the Iran file was already open on every desk in every relevant agency. Reports of a possible deal or framework being discussed, oil prices reacting, allies watching, rivals calculating. One departure can be explained away. One departure during a geopolitical inflection point raises a different kind of question. Not, why did she leave? But, what did her leaving reveal about the pressure that is already there? Now, I get to the heart of it. Iran has, over the past several weeks, done something genuinely difficult to do to a superpower. It has turned one foreign policy crisis into three separate domestic political problems simultaneously. Problem 1, war risk. If Trump escalates, if airstrikes go further, if military pressure intensifies, oil moves, region destabilizes, allies get nervous, and the American public starts asking what exactly the endgame is. Problem 2, deal risk. If Trump negotiates, if a framework is reached, if Iran gets sanctions relief or any significant concession, then the hawks inside his own coalition and Israel call it weakness. They call it appeasement. They compare it to every deal they have ever criticized. And that criticism lands in a political environment where being called weak is expensive. Problem 3, the waiting problem. If Trump does neither, if he holds maximum pressure and waits, Iran is not standing still. Time in negotiations when one side is under sanctions and the other is managing its nuclear program does not move symmetrically. Every path has a cost. Every option has a political bill attached. This is not incompetence. This is the nature of the Iran problem. Iran has been forcing exactly this kind of choice on Washington for more than 2 decades. The playbook is not new. What is different now is the political environment in which Trump must execute his answer. Reports indicate a possible U.S.-Iran deal or framework has been under discussion. I want to be precise here. A framework is not a final deal. What the exact terms look like, which issues remain open, what Iran has or has not agreed to, these are questions where the honest answer is, the picture is still forming. What I do know is that any framework, any hint of softening, creates immediate pressure from 2 directions. From the right, the argument is, any deal that leaves Iran with leverage is a bad deal. Israel reinforces this message consistently. Israeli officials have made their skepticism of softer agreements with Iran a cornerstone of their foreign policy communication. From the non-interventionist wing, the calculation is different. They do not want war, but they also do not want a deal that looks like a replay of past agreements that they argued gave Iran too much room. And in the middle, Trump, who came to office saying he could make the best deals, who withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement in 2018, calling it the worst deal ever made, and who now faces the possibility of producing something that looks, to someone, like a version of what he rejected. The political geometry here is not comfortable, and Iran does not need to win militarily to benefit from all of this. Iran only needs to make every American option look expensive. That is a form of leverage. It is slower than a military victory. But in the long game of Middle Eastern politics, it may be just as effective. Because if Washington cannot agree on which option to take, Iran does not need to defeat the option. And that is where a foreign crisis becomes a domestic political bomb. Every major decision in this Iran file rests on a foundation that most people never think about. Intelligence. Not the dramatic kind, not the cloak and dagger kind, the unglamorous, careful, deeply uncertain kind. Analysts sitting in windowless rooms, reading intercepts, building probabilistic assessments, and writing things like, with moderate confidence, and the evidence suggests but does not confirm. Before Trump's team can decide whether to strike, negotiate, sanction, or contain Iran, they need answers to very specific questions. How close is Iran to a nuclear threshold? Not in the political sense, in the technical, verified, real-world sense. What is Tehran actually willing to accept? Not what Iranian officials say in press statements, what they will accept when the cameras are off. What happens to American forces and regional allies if Hormuz becomes a sustained flashpoint, rather than a temporary pressure point? What are China and Russia doing with the window created by American distraction? What is the realistic timeline if negotiations collapse? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the literal inputs into every option on the table. And here is the complication that is worth understanding clearly. In a well-functioning national security system, intelligence feeds into policy. The two are separate. Intelligence tells you what is true. Policy decides what to do about it. But in practice, historically, across multiple administrations, those two functions do not always stay cleanly separated. U.S. intelligence assessments and the political messaging coming out of the White House have not always described the Iran threat in exactly the same way. This is not unique to one administration. It is a structural problem in how democracies make foreign policy decisions under political pressure. When the intelligence picture and the political picture start to diverge, something important happens. Decisions start to look less like strategy. They start to look like improvisation. An improvisation near a nuclear-capable state, with one of the world's most strategic waterways in the background, is not a category of risk that markets price calmly. Here is the deeper issue. If one part of the national security team reads the intelligence and concludes Iran is an immediate and escalating threat that demands military response, and another part of that same team reads the same intelligence and concludes Iran is a complicated problem that demands a complicated diplomatic solution, then the fight is no longer only between Washington and Tehran. A fight is inside the American decision-making system itself, and that fight cannot stay invisible forever. The intelligence debate around Iran is not about whether Iran is a problem. Everyone agrees Iran is a problem. The debate is about what kind of problem it is. Is it a problem you solve with force, with diplomacy, with sustained economic pressure? With some combination that has never quite been defined clearly enough for everyone in the room to execute coherently? The question is not only what Iran is doing. The question is whether Washington agrees on what the intelligence means. Iran may not be testing only America's military. It may be testing America's decision-making system. And if the answer to that second question is no, then every option becomes a gamble. Let me zoom out now. Not to Washington, not to Tehran, to the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow passage of water, roughly 33 kilometers at its narrowest point, between the Omani coast and the coast of Iran. It does not look, on a map, like one of the most powerful economic levers on the planet, but it is. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through or near the Strait of Hormuz. Depending on which estimate you use, the number varies slightly, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute. One narrow waterway, 5 nations that matter to global energy: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself, all dependent on that passage for their export routes. When that choke point is stable, the global economy does not notice it. Oil flows, prices reflect supply and demand, and the Strait of Hormuz appears in the news about as often as a highway rest stop. When that choke point is uncertain, when there are military movements, when diplomatic signals suggest potential escalation, when the question of who controls what in the Persian Gulf becomes open, markets notice immediately. They do not wait for confirmation. They price the risk of disruption before the disruption happens, and that is exactly what has been happening. Oil prices have moved sharply on news related to Iran and Hormuz, not because a single tanker was seized, not because a specific military action triggered it, but because uncertainty near one of the world's great energy choke points is itself a market signal. Uncertainty is not free. It has a price, and that price moves. Oil price moves upward, even modestly. Energy costs rise for refiners. Refiners pass costs to distributors. Distributors pass costs to retailers. Retailers pass costs to every American who fills up a tank, buys groceries, or pays for anything that was shipped. Delivery costs, food prices, utility bills, the cost of manufacturing anything that requires energy, which is almost everything. This is not a foreign policy story anymore. This is a household budget story. Most Americans over 50 have lived through at least 2 or 3 major oil price shocks. 1973, 1979, the Gulf War, 2008. Each time the mechanism was the same: a geopolitical event, a choke point, a price spike, and then a wave of inflation that arrived months later and stayed longer than anyone expected. This time, the mechanism is the same. The variables are different. Inflation is already a political wound in America. Gas prices are already a political wound. The Federal Reserve's response to sustained energy-driven inflation is already a concern for anyone with a retirement account, a mortgage, or a fixed income. Most Americans do not follow every advisor in the Situation Room, but they understand the gas station. They understand the grocery bill. They understand what it feels like when the numbers on the pump keep moving upward, and nobody in Washington seems to have a clear plan for why it is happening or how to stop it. That is where the Iran split stops being an abstraction. The split may begin in the Situation Room, but the bill can show up at the pump. And right now, the pump is watching Washington very carefully. In geopolitics, confusion is not neutral. Confusion becomes a resource. It becomes a form of leverage that rivals and adversaries can use without firing a single shot, without moving a single missile. So let me ask the question that this whole video has been building toward. If Washington looks divided on Iran, if the intelligence picture is contested, if the policy options each carry a painful cost, if the departure of a senior official raises questions about unity, who benefits? Let me go through it carefully. Iran. Iran may gain something more valuable than any military victory right now: time. If Washington cannot agree on whether to escalate, negotiate, or pressure, then Iran is not under the kind of unified, coherent strategic pressure that actually changes state behavior. Sanctions work best when they are part of a strategy, not a substitute for one. Military pressure works best when it is credible, sustained, and backed by a team that is visibly aligned. Diplomatic pressure works best when the other side believes the alternative is something worse. If none of those conditions are cleanly met, because the team appears divided, then Iran can keep managing its nuclear program, keep building its leverage in regional proxy networks, and keep waiting for Washington's internal argument to resolve itself. Iran does not need to win. It only needs to avoid losing for long enough that the political cost of continuing the pressure becomes too high for Washington to sustain. Israel. Israel's calculus is different and worth understanding precisely. Israeli officials have been publicly skeptical of any softer deal with Iran. Their concern is not abstract. Israel lives within strike range of Iranian ballistic missiles. It lives within the operational range of Iranian-backed forces in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza. Its security calculus is not the same as Washington's. If a deal emerges that Israeli leaders believe gives Iran too much room on nuclear stockpiles, on enrichment capacity, on sanctions relief, Israel will say so loudly. It will lobby its allies in the U.S. Congress. It will make the political cost of any deal visible. That is not a conspiracy. That is a sovereign state pursuing its survival interests through every available channel. Israel has done this for decades and will continue doing it. The question is whether a divided Washington can manage that pressure alongside all the other pressures simultaneously. China. China's stake in the Iran situation is less dramatic than the headlines sometimes suggest, but it is real and worth naming clearly. China has been one of Iran's most significant customers for oil, particularly under sanctions pressure that has pushed Iranian exports toward non-Western markets. China's long-term strategic interest in Persian Gulf stability is complex. It wants cheap energy, but it also wants Hormuz functional, since Chinese shipping passes through those waters too. What China watches more carefully than the outcome of any specific Iran deal is whether American attention remains split. A United States that is simultaneously managing an Iran crisis, debating internal strategy, watching oil markets move, and processing a senior intelligence departure is a United States with a narrower bandwidth for everything else. That matters in the South China Sea. That matters in Taiwan. That matters in every theater where American credibility is a daily currency. I am not saying China is behind anything happening in Washington. The evidence does not support that claim, and I will not make it. I am saying that geopolitical rivals observe, they calculate, and they prefer their rivals distracted. Trump's domestic position. Here is the political geometry that makes this moment particularly uncomfortable. Trump came to office in his second term with a specific foreign policy brand: maximum pressure, strong deals, no endless wars, America's interests first. Each of those elements is now in tension with the others on Iran. Maximum pressure requires credible escalation. Credible escalation risks a wider war that most Americans do not want. A strong deal requires Iran accepting terms that satisfy hawks. Satisfying hawks while also satisfying non-interventionists, while also satisfying Israel, while also keeping oil prices from spiking, is not a puzzle that has an obvious answer. No endless wars is a message that resonates with American voters. But maximum pressure, if it fails to produce a deal, can become a long, ambiguous, expensive holding pattern, which sounds a lot like what it claims not to be. Trump risks criticism from two directions at once. If he escalates, critics say he is reckless. If he deals, critics say he is weak. If he waits, critics say he has no strategy. That is a difficult political position. It is also a position that Iran's strategic patience has helped create. Ordinary Americans, and finally, the people watching this video. Not the ones in the Situation Room, the ones trying to figure out whether their retirement accounts are stable, whether the inflation they have been managing for 3 years is about to get a second wind from an energy shock, whether the instability they see in Washington is going to cost them something real and personal. Gas prices are not an abstraction for most Americans over 50. Neither is inflation. Neither is the experience of watching powerful people argue in public while prices move at the grocery store. In geopolitics, the people who pay first for confusion are not usually the ones making the decisions. They are the ones making the grocery list. Here is what I can say with confidence. Iran has not split Trump's team. I do not have proof of that, and I am not claiming it. But Iran may have exposed something that was already there. A tension between escalation and diplomacy, between intelligence caution and political urgency, between the oil market reality and the political narrative, between what America's allies need and what American voters will accept. These tensions exist in every administration. They are not unique to this one, but they are particularly acute right now, on this particular file, at this particular moment. The departure of a director of national intelligence during an active Iran crisis does not prove the team is broken, but it raises a question that rivals, allies, and markets are all asking at the same time. Can Washington speak with one voice on Iran when war, intelligence, oil, and politics are all pulling in different directions simultaneously? History offers a clear answer about what happens when the answer is no. When America looks divided, rivals calculate the opportunity. When allies see uncertainty, they start building their own contingencies. When markets price confusion, the cost moves downstream, from the futures desk to the gas station to the grocery store to the household budget. The story that began with a resignation and an Iran rumor does not end in Washington. It does not end in Tehran. It ends in the daily decisions that ordinary Americans make when the world outside starts to cost more than it did last year. Iran may not have split America, but it may have exposed the split that was already there. And if that split cannot be turned into one clear strategy, one voice, one direction, one credible message to allies, rivals, and markets, then the price of that confusion will not stay inside the Situation Room. Do you think Trump should strike Iran, cut a deal, or keep maximum pressure? And which option would cost Americans the most? Leave your answer below. And if you find this kind of analysis useful, if you want to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening and who pays the price, subscribe to my channel. I cover the stories behind the stories, and I am just getting started.